John, can I go ahead and introduce you?
Sure.
Okay. Vanessa asked me to come by and say hello tonight. My name is David Weisberger, and I just started at URI this September, replacing Andy Radin as the cooperative extension agent, working with vegetable and fruit producers in the state. Just here to introduce John for what should be an interesting talk tonight, which is titled Building and Managing a High Tunnel System, Small-Scale Urban and Suburban Production. John is an associate professor of agroecology here in the Department of Plant Sciences and Entomology. I think we have a few things about cooperative extension to share and housekeeping, and then John's going to take it from there.
All right. Thank you, David. Welcome to the URI College of the Environment and Life Sciences and to URI Cooperative Extension's educational webinar series, Learn at Home. And we're really glad that you're joining us this evening for this presentation. Now, the University of Rhode Island is Rhode Island's land-grant institution, which means it has a three-pronged mission: teaching, research, and extension. Cooperative extension is the arm of the university that brings science-based resources out to the public and exists in every state in the US. We focus on 5 strategic areas of focus: extending information through outreach programs about land stewardship, food systems and agriculture, water resources, healthy lifestyles, and energy literacy. So just some housekeeping here. So please enter your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the program. And so this session is being recorded, so please visit our URI Cooperative Extension YouTube channel to access the recording, and for other webinars offered through the Cooperative Extension at URI. The recorded webinars are closed captioned for the hearing impaired. So what I'd like to talk about this evening is this project that I conducted. It was a collaboration between the University of Rhode Island and the Southside Community Land Trust. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with SCLT, but they are the largest urban agriculture service provider in Rhode Island. So this work was funded by Rhode Island USDA NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant. And yes, as I mentioned, it was a collaboration with SCLT, and we can see in this map just some of the many community gardens and also urban farms that they support in and around Providence. So the rationale for this project emerged in our conversations with SCLT, and that is that urban communities, particularly low-income and immigrant communities, can benefit from small-scale distributed high-tunnel production, but ex-urban models need to be adapted to urban conditions. So these sort of more rural models really need to be adapted for city production or suburban production for that matter. Because while developed specifically for urban conditions, our project, the system that we developed, is really applicable to small-scale production anywhere, including backyards and suburban areas. So growers in these areas may face many of the same challenges as urban growers, as we'll discuss. So if you're not familiar with what a high tunnel is basically an unheated greenhouse. It doesn't have quite the same level of infrastructure as a greenhouse, which is a heated structure, usually intended for full year production. So commercial scale high tunnels really are suitable only for large urban farms, as we can see here with the high tunnel at the Global Refugee Training Farm, which is about 80 feet long, and this lot is about an acre in size. The farm is about an acre in size. Now we know that vacant urban land in Rhode Island and in many other cities is really at a premium. And so urban farmers and urban growers are really operating on very small scale parcels, often a vacant lot or maybe a backyard or a side yard. And we also know that, of course, Rhode Island is the second most densely populated state in the United States. So land is at a premium for uses other than food production, unfortunately. Another potential issue with high tunnels in these urban areas is that they may offend the aesthetic sensibilities of neighbors and government officials, possibly even more than urban agriculture projects can in general. So there unfortunately have been bans, like this one in Elmhurst, Illinois, which prohibited hoop houses, which is another name that high tunnels are known by, in backyards. Fortunately, this ban, which was implemented around 2019, has been overturned at this point. Another potential issue with high tunnels in urban areas is the runoff from the plastic covering. And this can, represents another form of impervious surface that contributes to urban stormwater pollution. That water just like runs into storm sewers and then into local streams and bodies of water, carrying with it pollution. And it also, is warmer than groundwater. So it also contributes to thermal pollution of these bodies of water. And also, obviously, because of their history of development, many urban soils and sometimes suburban soils may be much different from soils found in non-urban production systems. These soils are often highly disturbed and contaminated. They're what we call anthrozols. They're soils that have developed because of human development, have been dominated by human interference. And so even suburban landowners need to be concerned about soil contamination. And we see in this image, a typical urban soil profile with a lot of fill, concrete, and bricks and so forth. Now, to sort of like get around, this problem of urban soil contamination, in my research, I've documented a number of approaches that farms and community gardens take to kind of like obviate soil contamination, including through cap and fill or raised bed fit systems. And so in this image, we see 4 different variations on the cap and fill system, in which basically the contaminated soil is being covered by a geotextile fabric, like a landscape fabric, but a very heavy duty one. And then clean growing medium, often consisting of a mixture of soil and compost, is placed on top of that geotextile fabric. Now, sometimes the entire lot is capped. That can be pretty expensive. It can be $50,000 or more for an acre to cap an entire site. And so sometimes some urban agriculturalists will like create these windrows of compost, as you can see in the second example, and then fill in the areas between those windrows with wood chips, for instance, cutting down on the expense, basically, of this cap and fill system. Sometimes there may also be another secondary cap on top of that geotextile fabric, consisting of wood chips or gravel, for instance, of varying depths. So one of the issues with these cap and fill systems or raised bed systems can be that rooting depth can be very limited. And so this graph just shows, for 15 farms that I documented in Chicago with cap and fill systems, the depth of the fill in those cap and fill systems, and it ranged anywhere from 8 to 16 inches. Now, I mentioned, that these cap and fill systems are often made from compost mixed with soil. And there is is growing really in recycling wastes to create a more circular urban metabolism, including using wastes as inputs in the form of compost, for instance, for urban agricultural production. So these are what we call technozols. So technozols are basically intentionally created growing media used in place of native soil. And so these can really can contribute to urban waste management. So these researchers, Grard et al., for example, evaluated the sort of horticultural properties of a number of different sort of soilless technozols that they created for rooftop production. Some of them were derived from municipal solid waste streams. So they were using green waste compost or spent mushroom compost, for instance, or crushed wood, and sometimes a mix of crushed wood and green waste compost, and found that these technozols, could support good plant growth and production. However, use of these these technosols often are very high in organic matter. And I have documented my research in Chicago and elsewhere, the levels of organic matter in these soils in these 15 Chicago urban farms and community gardens, for instance. The percentage of organic matter ranged up to more than 30%, which is probably about 10 times to 15 times higher than the level of soil organic matter we usually find in agricultural soils here in New England. And so this really presents unique water and nutrient management challenges, because it's not like managing a regular native soil, like an in-ground system, an in-ground garden. However, I have found that despite all of these challenges, that these cap and fill systems can be as productive as in-ground systems based on some experimental research that I conducted at the URI Gardener Crops Research Center over a period of 3 years. And so data from this study, where I sort of like replicated an urban cap and fill system, sort of the dark gray bar, performed at least as well as in-ground systems in the lighter gray bars here at the URI Gardener Crops Research Center for vegetable crops, and often yielded much more than regional averages for New England, shown in blue, and US averages shown in green. So we know that these cap and fill systems that are used to address the soil problem can be very productive. So we developed, the goal of our project really was to develop and evaluate the performance of an urban adapted high tunnel system that could address these issues simultaneously while focusing on the production of culturally important crops for Rhode Island's diverse communities. So system components include a Gothic arch high tunnel from a New England manufacturer that was on NRCS's, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, list of manufacturers that are approved for the Environmental Quality Improvement Program, which provides funding for certain systems and practices that urban agricultural growers might adopt. It features double plastic for installation with roll-up sides for ventilation, an internal raised bed filled to a depth of 14 inches with local yard waste compost from the Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation, drip irrigation, rain gardens on either side with native plants to infiltrate runoff, to improve high tunnel aesthetics, to potentially furnish a crop of cut flowers that the urban grower could sell, and also to increase system biodiversity, and inside a combination of what are called world crops that are integral to the foodways of Rhode Island's diverse communities. And we also grew 2 high-value crops, ginger and turmeric. And this, the beds were also, I must note, capped with a geotextile barrier too. So, we wanted to evaluate this system. So we compared high tunnel production to outdoor production in a controlled experiment at URI. And so we constructed raised beds from untreated 2x8 kiln-dried spruce stock that we just purchased from a local lumber yard. And the boards were screwed to corner posts made from 2x4s and were spliced using 2x8 stock to create the raised bed. Now, we used untreated lumber because we wanted to grow crops under organic conditions, as do many urban growers. And over 4 years, 4 years after we first constructed these beds, the boards are just starting to decompose. So they've been pretty durable, despite the fact that they're not treated. Now, the beds were lined with geotextile barrier, meeting City of Boston standards for urban agriculture. There's very little information out there, unfortunately, about the type of geotextile to use in raised beds. And at the time, I could find only a fact sheet from Boston describing criteria for puncture resistance and other factors, for instance, the tightness of the weave, which is why I followed their criteria, their standards when selecting a barrier for the bottom of the beds. So the planting area within the frame consists of 4 beds that are 30 inches wide, separated by 3 16-inch paths. So we have 4 beds going across the large, like raised bed, basically. And then to reduce material costs, paths were filled to depth with wood chips. So mimicking some of these systems that I've seen in use on urban farms. So we also included a small foyer for the high tunnel and replicated it with the outdoor bed. So that, when you step into the high tunnel, there's like an area, you're not stepping right into a bed. Now, as I mentioned, we did use 100% compost sourced from the Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation. Now, this is an organic certified compost made, as I mentioned, from yard waste. And our original plan was to use a 50-50 mix of topsoil and compost based on our experience with that other experiment. And also based on some experimental work that was done in Illinois at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I got my PhD. However, spring weather conditions at the time we were setting up this experiment prevented the timely mixing of topsoil and compost because it was just too wet. So we decided to use just a straight compost. And it's continued to support plant growth for 4 years now, though the depth is half of what it was initially because of the decomposition of the organic matter. Our beds were identical in both high tunnel and outdoor systems. But then we constructed high tunnels around one set of beds. So we built and filled the beds first and then built the high tunnels around the beds, around 4 of these beds. And so we had 8 beds total, 4 outdoor, 4 within these high tunnels. Now, as I mentioned, a high tunnel kit from a USDA NRCS equip approved vendor was used. Now, this was Ledgewood Farm Greenhouse Frames, which is located in New Hampshire. The EQIP program does provide financial support for agricultural producers for high tunnels and other systems and practices. The program, however, doesn't allow growers to make their own tunnels. They have to use tunnel kits from an approved vendor, which is why we used one. The cost of this kit was approximately $1,800 in 2018, $1,800, and it might have gone up by now, I'm not sure. So the kit included the metal posts and hoops, hardware for the roll-up sides, fasteners, and a double layer of plastic to cover the top of the tunnel. Not included was lumber for the end walls or hit boards or the covering for the end walls. Now, the vendor provided detailed installation instructions with photos, as I would expect any vendor to, and the instructions were easy to follow. Honestly, this was the first time I'd constructed a high tunnel, and so it was a little bit daunting, the first couple, but I was really kind of surprised by how easy it was. It definitely is something that someone can do, in a vacant lot or in a backyard, for instance. So this is just one of the slides from the instructions from the high tunnel vendor that shows the spacing and driving of the posts that one puts the metal arches over then. So we constructed the hip boards. The hip boards are sort of the boards, in this case, in the Gothic arched greenhouse, are located around chest height. And these and the end walls were constructed from locally purchased lumber. Another option is to use metal tubing for the end walls too, which would be more durable. Again, we used untreated lumber. And then end wall plastic, which we secured from an online vendor, was secured to the frame, to the metal frame with metal channel and zigzag wire before the tops of the tunnels were covered. And so my graduate student, Mishreki Lawandi, and several undergraduate students helped with this project. So it was a great way to get the students involved in work at the farm. Now, securing the tunnel covering was a 4-person job. As the URI agronomy farm, the Gardener Crops Research Center, is always kind of windy. So it's always a bit of can be challenging to do something with a large piece of plastic like this. But I'm sure that on a calm day, it would probably, with an experienced crew, might require just a couple people. So the covering was secured to the hip boards with furring strips. And then below the hip boards, 2 pipe for the roll-up slides with plastic clips. So the pipe and also the plastic clips were provided as part of the kit. Then lengthwise on each side of the of the high tunnel, we constructed these rain gardens. So we dug them to a depth of about 1 foot and a width of 3 feet on each side of each tunnel. And we planted these with plugs of 10 different species of plants that are native to the Northeast. We selected these plants for their ability to tolerate occasionally flooded soils, for their aesthetic qualities, and also for their ease of cultivation. And we had a really nice mix that bloomed throughout the season. Now, the growth of the rain garden plants was modest the first year in 2019. This is an image, fall 2019, from one of our twilight walks at the farm. And we planted swamp milkweed, but it was devoured by monarch caterpillars. And unfortunately, the swamp milkweed didn't survive until 2020, but the rest of the plants did. And in fact, the second season by fall 20, this is probably more like late summer 2020, the growth of the other plants in the rain gardens was exuberant. Now we started, we planted vegetable transplants transplanted them into the high tunnels in early May for our warm weather crops. We started our vegetable plants in greenhouses here at the University of Rhode Island, but they could easily be started indoors on a windowsill and then moved into the high tunnel in April because it was definitely warm enough then to be growing transplants. And the crops are really intensively planted with, maybe about a foot of spacing between each plant, really to maximize use of space. And so production was evaluated in the high tunnels and compared to production outdoors for 2 summers, 2019 and 2020. And so growth was relatively restrained in 2019, but it was much more exuberant in 2020. In 2019, we did add fertilizer, about 50-pound ProGrow, an organic fertilizer at a rate of about 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But it was much more exuberant in 2020, and we didn't fertilize in 2020, probably due to the decomposition of the organic matter in the compost and the release of nutrients, particularly nitrogen. And also by the second season, there was definitely a learning curve here for me. By the second season, I'd learned to better manage the technosol water content, because one of the problems if you are using 100% compost, and this is what the researchers at the University of Illinois found, was that it does drain very quickly and it doesn't really retain as much water as you would think, particularly it seems this yard waste compost. And so it needed to be watered frequently and lightly. And so I became much better by 2020 in terms of managing the soil moisture. In the second year also, you'll notice we did add a trellis to the north wall of the high tunnel to support the growth of bitter melon, which is a common crop in Asia that appreciated both the trellis and the heat of the tunnel. It did quite well within the high tunnel. After transplanting, we watered with an overhead sprinkler just because we weren't getting really nice kind of lateral flow from the drip irrigation system that we had installed. We installed 2 lines of drip tape per bed, and we weren't getting lateral flow, and so it was missing some of the seedlings of the transplant. So we used an overhead fan type sprinkler initially, just until the transplants had become established. And then we switched over to the more water-wise drip irrigation system. Now, in the first 2 years, we didn't use any sort of mulch, but just this past year, we did start to use landscape fabric. So we started planting our transplants through landscape fabric in the high tunnels for weed control and moisture retention, and it's been quite successful. And so I would recommend that, definitely, using something like landscape fabric on top of the technosol surface. And so we can see, that growth was relatively weak in 2019 in the outdoor beds, again, probably because it was relatively fresh compost and had not started to mineralize and release nutrients. But then again, we saw like a similar sort of explosion in growth in the outdoor beds in 2020. And again, you can see the bitter melon in the background on the trellis that we added in year 2, also to the outdoor beds to replicate the trellis that we added in the interior beds. Now, these are just some of the crops that we grew. So we did plant spring and fall crops in the tunnels, but not in the outdoor beds. And they did quite well, these spring and fall crops. Particularly the bok choy and also the lettuce did really well. And our summer crops, these were these world crops that basically are important to the foodways of diverse cultural groups. We did consult with gardeners, and farmers, growers working with Southside Community Land Trust and other people that I knew who were members of these groups who were growing these plants, in their community garden plots or their market gardens, and about what we should grow. And so we grew okra, for instance, and sweet potato, a Dominican variety of tomato, roselle, also known as sour leaf, which you might know from red zinger tea. The calyx is used to make red zinger tea. The leaves are also eaten in West Africa and the Caribbean and also in Asia, and are quite tasty. An Asian eggplant variety. Cubanelle pepper and papalo, Thai basil, and some different peppers. Ají dulce, which is an important part of sofrito, along with the Cubanelle pepper in the Caribbean. Some hot peppers like amazing and habanero, Numex orange, and Bangkok. And then also these 2 tropical high-value crops, ginger and turmeric. And just some of the images of these 14 warm weather crops that we planted, some okra, some roselle or sour leaf, some of the ají dulce pepper, which looks like little turbans, super cute, and papalo, which is a very aromatic herb that's used in Central America and South America. And then these are our 2 high-value crops, turmeric on the left and ginger on the right. We grew them in the high tunnels both years, but we grew them in the outdoor beds only in 2020 because a report that I read online had led me to believe that these crops wouldn't yield anything outdoors, which we found wasn't true in the case of ginger. It wasn't the case of turmeric. Turmeric didn't yield anything outside. And so, the ginger yielded some really beautiful baby ginger both years. The turmeric yielded nothing the first year, but I replanted it the second year and it yielded at a similar level to that of the ginger. Now, we also established demonstration tunnels at 3 Southside Community Land Trust sites around Providence, including Gallego Court Community Farm in Pawtucket. So this is a community garden and farm in a public housing development in Pawtucket. And this is the interior. This was a farm that's run by Southside Community Land Trust and was operated by local growers. Now, when we did find that, these high tunnels did add value to production. So high tunnels significantly increased value of rolled crops and ginger in both years. So we can see in blue, the outdoor beds in blue in 2019, 2020. So we can see that world crops, outdoor bed in blue, green is the high tunnel. 2019, these world crops, this assemblage of 14 crops, that the value of the crops per square foot was about double in the high tunnels compared to the outdoor beds. Of course, we couldn't make a comparison between the ginger indoors and outdoors in 2019 because it was only grown indoors. But we can see that again in 2020, the world crops yielded about value was about 50% higher in the high tunnels compared to the outdoor beds. And we can see that the ginger value of the ginger produced was about double in the high tunnels per square foot compared to the outdoor beds. So definitely a big advantage to using the high tunnel in terms of productivity for all of these crops. Now, we did find that there were some challenges too. So this was a learning experience that I hope that folks can benefit from. There was definitely, as we saw, a learning curve associated with effectively managing nutrients and water in these technosols, in these artificially made soils. There wasn't much release of nutrients initially, and in the first year, there was quite a bit of nutrient release in the second year. Water was difficult to manage, but we sort of got a better handle on that in the second year. Now, within 4 years, the substrate level, was half of its original height due to settling and decomposition, but still seemed to support good plant growth. However, in general, I would recommend using more of a 50-50 soil compost mix if you must use a technosol in your high tunnel because of soil contamination of the underlying soil. Now, as you can see, by 2021, the rain gardens had gotten a bit messy. In 2022, we did cut the plants back by half in June, and this helped quite a bit, but these might have started to block some of the airflow into the high tunnels from the sides, unfortunately. These urban soils can be really challenging because they're often filled with debris. So poor anchorage of posts in a debris-filled urban soil combined with a slightly sloping site and the need to leave the posts almost 15 inches higher than they should have been. Usually they would have been driven down 15 inches more, but we left them high to accommodate the height of the raised beds. That led to failure during a severe windstorm at the Gallego Community Farm in Pawtucket. So we later fixed this site and we placed some of the posts in concrete footings for better anchorage and stability. On retrofit sites, like for instance, the Gallego Community Farm, where we were fitting this high tunnel onto a site that already had established garden plots, we found that there really wasn't any space for rain gardens. So you can actually attach rain gutters to the hip boards above the roll-up sides and collect rainwater for irrigation. So that might be a better option in cases like this, to collect rainwater for irrigation within the high tunnel. Land access can also be a challenge. So you have to make sure that you have clear access to, and tenure to the land before you put your high tunnel on it, because this site unfortunately sat empty for most of the project because of ongoing leasing, then sales negotiations with the owner of the vacant lot. So that was very frustrating. And then off-season water access is something that you have to be aware of if you are putting one of these in a community garden, for instance. So water access can be an issue, limiting 3 or 4 season use of tunnels. Water in this community garden and farm is controlled by the Pawtucket Housing Authority, which shuts off the water in early October, which makes it hard to grow a winter crop in the high tunnel, basically. So some takeaways from this project that I hope that folks can learn from if they're going to be developing and installing their own urban or suburban high tunnel at the scale is that these high tunnel systems do increase productivity of world crop polycultures. And so I think it's important to definitely identify crops that will benefit from the additional heat that they get and also the protection from the wind that they get in a high tunnel. High value crops, which we found did much better within the high tunnels than in the open air. These can, help subsidize production of other crops, including these world crops, for instance, which can potentially increase food security in urban areas. Rain garden floral crops could enhance profitability if we had harvested some of those native flowering plants that we grew in the rain gardens. And spring and fall winter crops could further increase profit if water is available. And we did find that, bok choy, for instance, and leaf lettuces did beautifully in these small high tunnels. So some things that I would modify going forward, potentially one could collect rainwater using gutters on space limited and water limited sites. I'd recommend selecting shorter natives, definitely, or cutting them back in June, cutting them in half, pruning them back by half, or selecting annual floral crops of shorter stature for the rain gardens that, again, could be harvested and sold and could contribute to the aesthetics of the high tunnel. I would specify from one of the vendors, if you're going to be using a raised bed, longer anchor posts that sort of account for the height of the raised bed. And then if it is, you are inserting them into rubble-filled soil, urban soil, potentially set at least some of them in concrete for better stability. And again, an increased non-organic component in the technosol. Potentially topsoil, for instance, native soil, or, that's uncontaminated, of course. There's also been some work that's been done on using construction debris, for instance, in technosols also. So there's some really interesting work that's being done out there. So just some steps to designing and implementing your own high tunnel. First of all, you want to, of course, identify a suitable site and secure long-term access. You should, if you are seeking financial support because you're an agricultural producer, contact your local NRCS office for more information on the Environmental Quality Improvement Program and funding that's available from it, because it can be substantial for high tunnels. You want to test the soil for contaminants, definitely lead and arsenic, I would say. Remediate for soil contamination if necessary, and I'll talk about that in a few seconds, what you can do. Know your market, right? If you're a market gardener, you don't want to grow crops and then have no market for them. So it's different it's important to, identify, what there's a market for and what crops might benefit from the additional heat of a high tunnel. You could, potentially even produce seedlings in the high tunnels. And I mentioned identify crops that will benefit from the summer heat. So in terms of selecting a site, often, you're going to be constrained to whatever land you have access to. But in general, you do want full sun. If you have less than full sun, this might limit production to, leafy vegetables that don't require as much light as fruiting vegetables like tomatoes, for instance. You want a site with minimal slope, less than 5%. Definitely, we had that problem at the Pawtucket site, the Galago Court Community Farm, where we had sort of a steep fall off on sort of one side of the high tunnel. Water access, you want to make sure that you do have water access, at least during the summer growing season. And you want to make sure that you have long-term land tenure, either through ownership, through, a land trust might own the land, or some other arrangement, including a contract. Now, one thing that folks often have questions about is, soil testing, and people are very concerned, of course, about contamination in these urban soils. And so you should always test your soil for basic contaminants, as I mentioned, like lead and arsenic. So your cooperative extension can point you to labs in your area that provide testing. In New England, most of the land-grant universities, not the University of Rhode Island, though, do provide testing and can offer guidance on how to collect samples from your site. I usually use a commercial lab in Ohio that I've used since I was, got my PhD. The EPA does have a really nice fact sheet, a basic fact sheet, reusing potentially contaminated landscapes, growing gardens, and urban soils, that has the basics about what you should know before you start developing a site. Now, unfortunately, and it's a little bit frustrating, but there's no real clear scientific consensus on what is a safe maximum soil lead level. So different researchers recommend different maximum soil lead levels for urban production, ranging anywhere from 300 parts per million to 1,200 parts per million, sort of depending on what kinds of crops are being grown and whether those are root crops or fruiting crops. Certainly, if you can't grow food crops, you could potentially grow like other crops, like floral crops, for instance. in that contaminated soil. The EPA generally recommends covering bare soil and play areas at levels exceeding 400 parts per million, but that's not really a useful guideline for gardening and farming. But you hear it out there sometimes. People say, oh, over 400 parts per million, you have to mitigate. Well, that's for children's play areas. There are a number of strategies that you can do to reduce exposure if you do find that your site is contaminated, but it's not like extremely contaminated. You can, for instance, minimize exposure to lead and other soil-borne contaminants by mulching the soil. Soil splashing, raindrops hit the soil, splash soil that's contaminated onto plant parts. You don't wash the plant parts off well, you consume the plant parts, and then you're consuming the lead and the other contaminants. That's a significant mechanism for contamination of edible plant parts by toxic metals. You can add organic matter, which both dilutes the soil concentration of the contaminants, and by encouraging more growth, reduces concentrations in plant tissues, according to the literature. You should maintain a neutral to basic soil pH, so above 6.5 pH. That's good for vegetable crops. And that's because lead and some other metals are more bioavailable at low pH levels, certainly below 5 or so. So maybe growing blueberries isn't such a great idea in contaminated soils. Select appropriate crops. You want to avoid root crops and leafy crops, and grow fruiting crops. You don't want to grow crops that grow in or close to the soil to reduce contamination by soil particles. It can be really difficult to remove those contaminated soil particles through washing. And if you want to grow fruiting vegetables like tomatoes or peppers, where the harvested plant parts are held well above the soil. In addition, crops really vary in their ability to absorb lead and other metals from the soil. So there's just lead's not all that bioavailable, but some plants are better at extracting it from the soil than others. You can grow crops in raised beds, as we often see in community gardens that are lined with one of these geotextiles, or you can grow in a cap and fill system like we saw in the presentation. So now if you're interested in finding out more about how to grow vegetables in urban soils, organically, I really recommend watching this webinar series that I participated in, Nurturing City Soils for Healthy Organic Vegetables. It's sort of targeted to a broad audience, from backyard gardeners to farmers. And it was produced by Purdue University with a grant from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And the presenters offer many suggestions for growing vegetables safely in urban settings. And then for general cultural information on vegetable crops, including some information on growing these crops in high tunnels, I really strongly recommend that you take a look at the New England Vegetable Management Guide. It's been sort of indispensable to kind of like my research here at the University of Rhode Island. And then if you're interested in expanding your knowledge of diverse vegetable crops, beyond the typical tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, I recommend the UMass World Crops site. It has lots of information on crops that are important to the foodways of many different cultures in the Northeast. And just like to reiterate that this project was supported by a Rhode Island Natural Resource Conservation Service Conservation Innovation Grant. And I've included some references including the eOrganic site for this Nurturing City Soils for Healthy Organic Vegetables webinar series, the UMass World Crop site, and the US EPA fact sheet on growing gardens and urban soils. Also, I guess you will, according to the notes here, get an online survey following the webinar, and it'll help us evaluate our impact in the community and constantly improve. Please also take advantage of our horticultural resources listed here. And so we really hope you enjoyed tonight's webinar. So here's some online gardening resources, URI gardening and environmental hotline, some general questions. David Weisberger, it's been great to have him on the staff, joining the staff and joining Cooperative Extension here at URI. Here is his email address. Here is some information on a link to the USDA NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the EQUIP. And then also they do have some information specifically about their high tunnel standard, basically specifications for that. And also I'm going to I was asked to put in a plug for those of you who love to learn about gardening and want to help their communities grow. The online application process for URI's Master Gardener Program Core Training runs June through November 1st each year for acceptance into the core training, which runs each spring. So you can find more details on the website in June. So we're sort of the next application deadline is November 1st, 2023. So you've got lots of time to prepare for that. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
I've already seen a couple of questions here. From Sarah Meyer. The first question is, do you have any resources particular to growing cut flowers in high tunnels? And she was hoping that we could say it, but also we can get some of the resources or ideas into the chat. That's
a really great question, and I wish I were prepared for it, because there are some really great resources out there for cut flowers. Off the top of my head, I don't know what they might be. Floret Farm and Floret Farm's website, I know is a great resource. They published a book, The Cut Flower Farm, and that's Aaron Benzakine. And that's like a great resource, I think, for cut flower gardeners. And then I can add, I think, maybe some of these. Oh, great. That's great, Sarah. Yeah, no, my PhD advisor is really interested in cut flowers, and we were talking quite a bit about her book and her website and what a great resource it is. How do you pollinate crops and hoop houses? In general, because this is a question from Candace Cliven, because the sides are up for most of the growing season, during which we're growing plants that require pollination. There are pollinators entering the hoop house, and that is actually one of the high tunnel. And that is one of the nice things about having those flowering plants in the rain gardens on either side of the high tunnel, is that they do attract more pollinators to the vicinity of the crops that are being grown within the high tunnel. Oh, and Sarah asked, what's the name of my advisor? And that's Sarah Taylor Lovell. No relation, but Sarah Taylor Lovell, and she's at the University of Missouri.
Jan, I'm guessing you're seeing this other question from Linda.
Yeah. So that is a good point about water becoming more expensive. And that's something I do need to definitely put together some enterprise worksheets, taking a look at the production cost of the high tunnels, and comparing production costs inside the tunnels and outside the tunnels. And water, that is a good point, is something that I need to consider, because of course at the URI Agronomy Farm, we're on our own water system. But in urban areas, yes, that is a barrier, is how expensive water is. One good thing about the high tunnels is that it does sort of reduce evaporation and raises lowers the vapor pressure deficit, so there's less evaporation within. But yeah, it's a good point that outside you are getting free water from rain.
Can I chime in about, can I say one thing, John, about that actually?
Sure.
So when I did some schooling in Iowa, and there was a horticulture program there, mainly in rural areas, but they were looking at water catchment options for high tunnels. And I will dig around. I think there's a couple tutorials. I can just pop them into the chat. For those that are interested, that would sort of kind of be a happy medium between free water and having to pay for irrigation.
I think the use of urban waste is really an interesting question. And that is something that I actually address in a little bit more detail in the webinar that I prepared for that Purdue University series, and talked a little bit about some of the programs that have been put in place for recycling some urban waste. It's just kind of like an emerging area of research. You do, of course, have to be concerned about contaminants entering the waste stream too. So you want to make sure that those are being kept out, of your allegedly clean fill that you're using in your cap and fill system. Definitely. Handle insect infestation, and that's a good question. So we did have to spray a couple times with pyrethrin, with organic approved, an insecticide approved for use in organic production, a couple times for thrips in the tunnels and also outside. We also do often have a Colorado potato beetle problem. And so we did, I had my undergraduate students picking the larvae off of the eggplant, for instance. And also one year we grew bitterball, which is also in Solanaceae. Potentially, if there isn't good, we didn't notice problems with mildew or mold growth in the high tunnels, but definitely that can be a problem with certain crops like tomatoes, for instance, and particularly when you are growing them, under those very intensive, conditions where the spacing is very tight between the individual plants. It can limit air circulation. And if I were, to grow, for instance, just one advantage I think of having these polycultures, so mixing different crop species within the high tunnels, was that if disease did emerge in one crop, it would spread throughout the entire high tunnel because they were different crops with different resistances to different pests. So I think that was helpful. All right, I think that is about it in terms of questions then. Any more questions? All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this presentation. And it will be posted on YouTube on the Cooperative Extension's website. So thank you and have a good night.